Hey guys, how's it going? I'm the Duke of Italy, your favorite lo-fi music YouTuber, and today, Drone Tuber. Just came up with that right off the dome. And we have a new brief series for you guys. A series that shouldn't be brief. It's just, I planned too much for this year, and consequently, next year, get ready for that. So now I have to do a lot in a few videos. The plan is a three-part series here, all based around guitar oriented drone music, specifically rock and metal. So I guess drone rock is the correct term. And we're covering a pretty giant, pretty expansive, slightly unforgiving chart. It's not my favorite chart I've ever covered. I'll tell you right now. I'm still listening to some stuff I'll be covering in part 3, but part 1 and 2 I have all the listings for, but it should be interesting. Before I get any further, I want to mention that Jen did the thumbnail for this series as well. If you guys have seen my previous videos, you've seen the wonderful work Jen has done, and now Jen did it again. So please give a nice follow, put some nice comments all over Instagram, X. I just linked the Instagram, so be good people. Not that that would be difficult. I love Jen's work, and you should too. But today we're gonna move on to drone rock and metal, and I guess today I'm covering a broad, somewhat leaning towards metal view of the genre. But today we are covering basically the foundations, the classics, the more accessible stuff, and as a result, some of the better stuff. In all honesty, even after going through 3/4 of this chart by now, I still think this section is probably the best of all of them. And we're going to start at the very beginning with the most essential parts of the genre, starting with probably the spiritual beginning of the whole genre, with Melvins, with Lysol, starting smack dab in the middle of the chart. So Melvins need no introduction, but here you get one of their seminal releases, one that's actually surprisingly hard, as it's not one that's actually surprisingly hard to find, as it's not really on streaming. You have to find like a sketchy download or something, and yet this is still such a formative album for the genre. It's disappeared off of Spotify time and time again, but I'm working on getting a physical copy myself, and you guys should too. This is a seminal work from a excellent band that went for a really long time without making anything bad. So, like a few of the releases we will be discussing in this chart, this is just one song. It's a 31-minute song, and it is depicted as one song, but in reality, it's more like 6 all sewn together in a giant suite, which is a very interesting concept for sure. But we do see Melvins here at their slowest, their sludgiest, and their droniest, as far as I can tell. I know Bullhead doesn't get this slow. I know their more accessible albums definitely do not get this slow. Now, it doesn't always drone, but there are points where the tone gets really abrasive and feedback soaked, which is absolutely formative for the genre. Even though it's not always drony, it is always sick and definitely apocalyptic sounding. This thing is barren, this thing is arid, this thing is hot. But as desolate as it is, it feels oddly inspiring. Some parts feel even a bit anthemic, even quotable. And oddly enough, there are points where it gets even softer in texture than Houdini, probably the most accessible Melvins album. This one you really got to experience for yourself. It's a really interesting experience, as well as one that basically started the whole genre. This is absolutely essential. On top of that, it's also great. It is fantastic, but really this is a great one to start with in general. And we drift away from the spiritual beginning to the genre with the argument for the real beginning for the genre. This is Earth, with Earth 2, an album that technically started the genre in terms of full-length albums and real drone metal. We wouldn't have anything without this. This being said, this is referred to as Earth 2 because Earth has an EP before this one, which is also drone metal, which isn't as well known, but I'd have to check it out at some point. And believe me, there are plenty of EPs on this chart. Thank God, you have to wade through your 2-hour-long albums, so it's nice to have something in between to sort of just nibble on a little bit. Earth 2 is not anything to nibble on. It is a 3-song, hour-long behemoth, where each song really just explores one riff. And oddly enough, this thing I heard recently is a concept album for coming down from Opiates, which is awesome. It's very easily noticeable that these guys are from Seattle, just due to that description alone. Surprisingly enough, the beginnings of this genre, at least in terms of its actuality, has a lot of feedback, but it's so perfectly tuned that it doesn't ever really come off as harsh or biting in any way. And oddly enough, I would kind of describe this album as melodic for drone metal. You know, the riff, it'll be like mostly one riff for like the whole song, but it's just such a good riff that you can't really blame them for repeating it the whole time. And the first two songs are just guitar until you reach the third song, the triumphant, huge, almost 30 minutes just surging forward with the really buried drums, the only song with drums, and it sounds amazing. Earth is known for being a very repetitive band, and even with their somewhat humble beginnings, they didn't act like it. They acted like the biggest thing ever, because it was the biggest thing ever. This thing sounds absolutely immense. It's crushing, but at the same time, it's very inspiring. It feels like you are exiting some sort of haze into the real world. It's really going to change how you feel after this thing. It's like really a sit down the whole time experience. It's great. It's absolutely seminal. It's absolutely essential. It is a critical point in music history for a lot of reasons. So listen to it. And then we're reaching another very seminal release here, Boris, which is the other important sludge metal band. We've covered some important names already, but Boris is here with their debut song, album, single, Absolute Ego. Now, Boris has another song called Absolute Ego from 2017, but ignore that one, because that one is less cool. This song right here is a 45-minute burner. It basically took Lysol and doubled down in length and heaviness. This thing is brutal, feedback-laden, harsh, mostly one riff. For about 20 minutes, it goes completely drumless, and then it just turns into this really intense part. It is a pretty humble beginning for Boris. As grand as this is, you clearly can tell that Boris has better material on the way, as the ideas aren't as fresh or new as something that Earth or Melvins have done, and the structure of the song doesn't appeal as much as some other things that'll come up on this chart. I will say, though, the ending of the track is unrelenting. I couldn't even tell you what instruments form the sound, because Boris is just so used to using harsh noise and all their stuff, a la my recent Boris and Merzbow review. Go check that one out, by the way. And this thing, it's just crazy. You know, you can't even tell where the tones are coming from. But Boris definitely does more interesting, more melodic, and more developed things in the future. They even do drone metal much better multiple times in the future. But this thing is quite good. I think it is worth checking out for any, at least, historical reasons. And up next, we're covering a bit of an oddball project. Not as essential, except it is the best thing we might cover on this entire chart. This is Naked City with Langche. If I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but it means Death of a Thousand Cuts. Now, Naked City is a band formed by a man named John Zorn, a sort of an avant-garde jazz composer who made sort of like a jazzy grindcore band, which was known for doing everything sort of wrong at the approach of grindcore because they were so jazzy and technical about it, and made really crazy, weird, developed sections of everything. But they've also delved into a bunch of other avant-garde genres as well. Now, Death of a Thousand Cuts is one song, and it is phenomenal. You have a guy wailing at the top of his lungs, not really harsh vocals, but he's just screaming as a normal man would scream. Vocals are all over, but if you wanted more shrillness and dissonance, you have a saxophone as well. There is intense burning feedback with a drummer that just rips through the mix with incredible talent. His fills are so unreal. Like the title suggests, this album is utterly tortured. You have wailing saxophone and wailing vocals. The whole time it feels like it is gasping for air. It is incredible. One of the coolest things I'll ever hear. This thing is great. It's fantastic. So much so that I have a CD of it just over there, now that I remember. We're already taking a weird dive to an atmospheric sludge section with a band called Kodiak with their self-titled album. Really interesting way that the chart just kind of dives into metal right here, but I'm going to go with it because I have a lot to cover. So this album is very accessible with some very beautiful atmospheric elements on top of the sludge metal. The melodic riffs on top of the droney elements are really nice. It adds a great touch and a real sense of beauty. And it has all these post-rock climaxes, which are so sick, really easy to enjoy, really not all that challenging in terms of this genre, but compared to other genres it'd be a little more difficult, but just tonally it's so thick and hazy, and despite there being no vocals, it still feels very dramatic. It has a whole lot of drama going on. It is exciting, it's really fun, it's great. And a very nice thing is that on Spotify this band's entire discography is under collection, so that's all you can really find, but I mean, it's a lot of good stuff. Then we got a band called Black Wolf Goat with an album called Dronolith, which is a definitely different album. It's sort of a post-rock solo guitar thing going on, but the way it manipulates texture and the way it builds melody on itself is so sick. About half this album is more akin to standard drone metal. It reminds me a lot of the song Introduction by Boris off of Akuma no Uda, but it sounds so well done. Now, unlike some drone metal, it doesn't rely on the heaviness to be sort of this crushing atmosphere. It tries to be meditative. The way it hypnotizes you throughout its entire length is rather beautiful, and it works in a way that is actually rather peaceful, despite the name of this album. It's texturally amazing, a really great display, still pretty accessible for drone music, and very enjoyable overall. It's great. I really enjoy it. And next we have a project that is not known for this at all anymore, Uboa. Yes, the death industrial artist who made one of the most acclaimed albums of 2024, now that we're in 2024, and the album previous to that was even more acclaimed, but we're not covering either of those. We're covering today an album called Sometimes Light, which you can only find on YouTube at this point, and I'm really mad that she won't just print the darn album on a CD for me, because it's my favorite Uboa release. Never has drone metal been so crushingly emotional. It is also strikingly beautiful with some of the most talented harsh vocals I've heard in any drone metal project. It sounds utterly wretched. It has a lot of drama and occasionally sounds very tortured, but it has more beautiful moments and excellent progression. And not to discredit the drumming. The drumming reminds me a lot of the Naked City record, which pretty crazy stuff. This is an album that really had me just like staring at the wall, and not in a meditative way, in a very emotional way. It's drone metal used to be very emotional, high impact music, and for that it's really fantastic. It's great. And if you want more post-rock and doom, we're going into more Boris with Flood. Now this album / song is one of a type that Boris would do a few times. It's another one song album, kind of like Absolute Ego, kind of like Feedbacker, but in this case, it is definitely more post-rock oriented. The drone elements, though, are not subtle at all. They do a lot to carry this thing up, and it's got a really cool dichotomy between the first movement, which is defined by a whole track. You know, this is one song, but it has different tracks going for it. You have the first movement, which is the same lick repeating over itself the whole time until this very light noise element just sort of floats around the bottom and turns higher and higher, and the whole riff loops on itself and falls out of sync. It's incredibly meditative and a great intro to a beautiful, amazing, and occasionally crushing giant song, this is also Boris at some of its most low fidelity. You know, this whole early period of Boris was kind of low fidelity, but here it's about as amazing as Boris can do it. You also get a very uplifting, amazing climax about 36 minutes in, which is only just barely past the halfway point. You have an amazing segue into these amazing, more melodic portions. This album really has everything. It reaches stuff as heavy as drone metal, but it has really soft, really slow, melodic, more rock portions. And rock really is the basis of this album, which is why I love Boris so much. They take rock music to its absolute extent, which sounds so good and is so cool. This album is great. It's one of my favorite Boris albums. Might be my favorite Boris album. Then we have a band called Ozva with Presences of Absences, which is a really amazing album that kind of reminds me of the stuff that Kylie Malone does over her past few albums. Not To Spring Had Its Joy, that album's just too long, but the foundation of this album is organ, which it's a lot of thick, heavy organ underneath with some organs on top. which the bassier stuff are these really long drawn out chords just in huge domineering, and on top it's much lighter and melodic and has sort of a post-rock feel to the whole thing. It builds and builds and has a variety of instruments. Now, if you listen to Kylie Malone and that's something you love, this might not be for you, as it's a bit more accessible. It's still definitely artistic and very much worth your time, but it doesn't have the insane level of patience that Kylie Malone has. It's deeply ritualistic as well as cathartic, as well as varied. You know, there are even really heavy drone metal guitars holding the whole thing down, which feels very different for what was being approached for here. It really has no bias towards any instrument. It's really supporting the composition. And there are these really cool male falsetto vocals that have sort of an angelic effect to the whole thing. It's a very bizarre track for sure. And if that wasn't enough to convince you, there is this incredible passionate drumming throughout the whole thing. This is like drone metal for lovers, which is awesome. This thing is great. I love the sort of religious sort of tinge to the whole thing, but don't get too tired of it. Which we have sort of a collaborative album here between Nadja and BBA with sort of an EP called Christ Send Light, sort of a holy minimalist influence thing here. It is one song at 20 minutes and is like the slowest, heaviest old school gospel ever. It feels overbearingly sad in the weirdest way, which is quite a unique feeling for the subject matter. And the biggest flaw with this thing is just how inaccessible it is to find. I could not myself find a file of it that was even loud enough. So perhaps I'll have to find a physical copy of this at some point in my life, because something felt like it was missing. And in all honesty, I feel like it was just the lack of volume. All of these drone albums I haven't mentioned yet, but all of them should be pretty loud enough to be the only thing you listen to, especially because the vocals remind me a bit of Cocteau Twins, which who doesn't love that? So I'm going to say right now this EP is good, but if you guys have any link for a high quality, high volume version of this thing, I'd really appreciate it, honestly. I think it's such a cool EP. It's such a cool release, but I want to be able to appreciate it to its fullest. And then we're going further down the line with a shoegaze edition with a band called Suffering Astrid, and let me pronounce this correctly. Personal Prisca, I don't know, Theologia. Yeah, that's what we have here, which is a bit like Have a Nice Life or Angelic Process. It is doom gaze for sure, and it is such a dense and swampy mix. I cannot tell if there are vocals. Probably not, but I really can't tell, which is very post-punky with how repetitive it is, which is very interesting for shoegaze. It's one of the coldest shoegaze albums I've ever heard. The drums, though, are insanely clicky, but this also feels like an album that was compressed in a weird way, as its dynamics are huge, which is fine, but it also feels dense for almost all of it, so it comes off as a weird thing. You know, it's a cool sense of experimentation, but it doesn't lend anything to the listening experience. And honestly, there are albums that do stuff like this a lot better. I really didn't get that much out of this listening experience. I still think it's okay. You know, all those genre elements are at least interesting enough to hold my attention for their listen, but I have no real desire to listen to it again. And speaking of Angelic Process with Weighing Souls with Sand. This album is amazing. Rest in peace to both people in this band, actually. I think the other member passed away just a year ago, and we actually get one of the most esoteric and sort of bizarre groups ever. One of my older videos of this style of discussion on this channel, back actually for a college project, I covered this band for like half a video, and my biggest gripe with this album is how extremely esoteric it is. You cannot find lyrics or a good pressing of this thing. I still have a copy of the CD of this, which sounds completely uncompressed, but also like super compressed. You know, the dynamics are there, but like everything is so crunched up. It's sort of like lacking in a little bit of clarity. So I'm kind of wondering, like, was there ever like a great pressing of this thing? But not to matter. You know, this is one of the most emotional, heart-wrenching sort of doomgaze-esque things ever, and it predates Have a Nice Life. Have a Nice Life does stuff kind of like this, but does a little less of the drone. Have a Nice Life does do a bit of stuff like this, but it doesn't engage with the droning as much. It does a little bit more post-punk, but here you get really super heavy drumming. The dynamics are really just to fill in ambient portions. It's really a dense, emotional experience, but also one that is like wildly esoteric, even in terms of subject matter. The lyrics you can't really find anywhere. In my own CD, which I think is a bootleg, but everyone is saying it's a real copy. It even misspells one of the songs, so I can't even tell what's even going on. So as bizarre and sort of broad emotion wise it is a highly engaging and heart-wrenching and emotional album. It feels like manic depression, but emphasis on the manic, because some moments feel actually extremely beautiful. I guess I could keep talking about that college project, because I took a poll. I had people take a poll on their opinion of one of the songs. I believe like a Summer of Snakes or something like that, and everyone had a completely different take on what it felt like to them. Emotion-wise, it was all different things. So you can't even say it's like crushingly depressing, but that is a sort of slightly general consensus here. There are very morbid themes all over this album, but whether or not it's a positive or negative thing, who is to know for sure? Morality is subjective after all, as long as you're not religious. Except, I just lied, Christ is King. But yeah, this really depressing album is great. Moving on, we have a single, Hello, by a band called Cloudkicker. It's 10 minutes of droney, hazy shoegaze from a band that's known for making progressive rock music. You have a really fun contrast of sound with the layers of noise. You have this sort of dotted percussion satellite, I would call it. It's really cool and sparse and totally interesting. There's just not a ton going on, which you'll hear me say a point like this a few times in this whole series, really. It's just there's an album that's like, not enough there for me, which seems a bit bizarre. It's like, why are you listening to drone? But it's just like there's not enough to chew on. There's not enough really getting me going there. So this thing's okay. There are cool elements. It feels like a cool concept of a song. I just wish it would turn into something. Going back into a band, Nadja with Radiance of Shadows. This is an 80-minute long album. And also this band, Nadja, I should mention, is one of the sort of earliest harbingers of like the doom gaze category, stuff that Have a Nice Life and Angelic Process did. It actually predates Have a Nice Life as well. If only they were as good. Seriously, this is a band that keeps making stuff, and I'm still struggling to really like them. It's kind of like a combination of a band called Bismuth and also Asva that we mentioned earlier, with the higher pitched sort of guitar textures, and also Bismuth with the more heavier droney sections. This album is also comprised of 3 giant songs, which unfortunately the version I could find on Spotify was just too quiet, which I don't know why you'd upload on Spotify without there being enough volume. I mean, now I'm lucky enough to have huge speakers, but just the level of compression does it no justice. I will say though, the production of how raw this thing sounds is amazing. There is piano that shows up from time to time that how crunchy and raw it is really gives it a lot of benefit, gives it a lot of emotion. And the final track has a really angular slowcore vibe to the whole thing. It is so sick, and I really do love albums that will soften up for the last track. I think it's a really cool take. I know Vane, the metalcore band, did that like a year ago. I know a lot of bands use a ballad for their last song. I think it's a cool idea. I think it works really well, and Asva does it pretty well here too. Sorry, Nadja. It's hard to remember because I listen to other albums of theirs and I just don't care all that much. But this one's good, I wish I heard it on like louder speakers. It's probably worth revisiting at some point, but their newest album's not. Well, that's the end of that sort of first section, but we're not done today. We went to the sort of positive side of accessibility, the more beautiful stuff, the more post-rock stuff, and now we're going to go into the sludgier and more metallic section. Even though it was already kind of sludge and atmospheric sludge, we're going into hate sludge areas. We're getting really deep and dirty and swampy. We're getting NOLA, and we're starting with a band called Monarch with a compilation called Dead Men Tell No Tales, which I actually purchased a copy of this before I even knew the band. I looked it up, saw it was drone metal at my local record store, and I was like, shoot, I'm buying this thing. It was like $6, and there are 2 CDs in there. It is based on 2 separate Monarch releases with extended versions of the previous tracks, and this thing is just punishing, while on other albums like 666, you get like really droney guitars. Here, like things hit instantly, and the only thing that like fills the space is like feedback, but even then it's not all the time. Everything feels so gross, so oppressive the whole time. Even the more spoken word track at the very end of this whole compilation is just brutal. There is a writhing female vocalist that sounds a lot like Lingua Ignota, which I think on 666 they use a male vocalist, which kind of pulls away from the uniqueness of this whole thing. If it's a female vocalist, I really can't tell. She's buried just slightly too much. Here, it's definitely sludgy. You almost have like a hardcore punk type of emotion. Even if I can't tell what she's saying, she is just tearing her throat out over the whole thing, on top of the mix just slightly, but this thing is excellent, as loud as possible. But unlike 666, this album has some variety here and there. You know, there are more ambient textures that show up. The spoken word track at the end is really cool. It's like poetry. This thing's really cool. It's very upsetting though. It's great though. I love it because I'm not very nice to myself. And up next is that band I discussed earlier for a moment, Bismuth with The Eternal Marshes, which this is just a feedback-filled, screeching, no gap single that's 16 minutes long. It feels like it is burning. The instrumentals are so horribly unclean. It's fantastic. And the cymbals have so much breadth to them. They're so wide that it seems to tie together the whole mix. In case there is going to be a gap, there is none. There's this really cool defined groove that just sort of melts into the ether about halfway through, in case you thought this was going to be a comfortable experience. And towards the end of the track, it just gets crushingly deep, really doubles down on the drone metal. It's so cool. This thing is great. Really excellent experience. I just wish I had more, which if you want this thing to be even harsher, the chart has a bad word here. But let's get even harsher with a band called Trees, with an album called Sickness In, which oddly enough is a band with 25-minute long full-length albums, which here you just get filthy, straight sludge, hateful attitude. One of the most just disgusting things I'll hear, at least on this chart. There are just 2 songs here, and it definitely has that Monarch type of feel, but it's also as engaging as Monarch is, at least on that particular release. The slightly raw production is a bit of a double-edged sword. You know, it benefits it with harshness and density, but it does lack a tiny bit of clarity. But on a good volume, this thing is sick anyway. It is just too punishing. It doesn't want to be your friend. It doesn't want to be accessible. It hates you. But unfortunately, I love it. It's great. I don't know how many times I could listen to it. It's just upsetting. It's gross, but I do like it a lot. And up next, we have another famous band here, sort of a side project of a band we won't discuss until at least next video, Khanate with Things Viral. For those of you who don't know, this is a band with 2 members of Sun, which is a band we will discuss a lot on this chart. Just hold your horses. And a vocalist, a very British sounding vocalist who likes to do power electronic style vocals. If you guys like, I don't know, White House, Romle, any of the power electronics with like vocals on it, you would like this. This is like if you turn that into drone metal. And he's got like, well, not as like horrible as power electronics vocals, because that stuff is like just the worst themes ever. This thing is like not too far off. It is just slightly more subtle than that stuff. And he's not doing harsh vocals in any traditional sense. He's just screaming like he knows how to. And honestly, I have to say the latest Khanate album I like more than this one. I think that one's great. But this album, as desolate as it is, feels very heavy. I will say though, it is a bit boring at points. So I'm just gonna say it's good. But I'm gonna tell you instead, you know, the rest of their discography is actually worth checking out. I'd say even more than this album here. So definitely give them a listen. You know, we gotta respect the Sun dudes. And that is sort of the end of that little section here. And we are going to cover sort of the end of this middle section. I'm just literally just covering this part just to segue into the next 2 parts without covering way too many things, because, you know, I'm covering a lot just today, which is odd because, you know, for how long these albums get, for how slow they are, I'm making something surprisingly short, at least for the subject matter at hand. We're going into a blackened section right now, where we have a touch of black metal, which, if you know me, you know me. I'm here for it. And where would this idea be without Sun, with their album Black One? Not their first album, but the first album of theirs we'll be covering on this series. And we even have earlier albums that will show up later on this chart, but this one is critical, you know, especially following the tracks of White 2, which we will discuss later, which was a very ambient experience, something very meditative. Here you get something slightly less subtle and a lot less friendly. You get a harrowing experience with just 2 tracks that are more riff focused, and the rest of this thing is very ambient filled, shorter cuts overall, while stuff like White 2 have just like 3 tracks with a very meditative, very almost spiritual approach to the whole thing. This one is death, with an amazing cast of noise musicians, and Rest from Leviathan on the second track doing vocals, and Malefic from Xasthur doing vocals on 2 other tracks with some of his best performances. They even lock him in a box for the final track. You get a sick vibe from this whole thing, as well as just an amazing experience overall. Archetypal of Sun's Weight, the tone is particularly feedback filled. Some of their most dense work to date. I believe their most dense work in their discography, except for maybe their first couple albums, which I've actually not heard. The transition from the dark riff giant known as Orthodox Caveman into Candlegoat, which is slightly more ambient, is a hellish transition and an amazing one as well. I'm very happy to say I have this album on CD as well. Can't wait to bust these tunes out on the road. But this thing is so sick. It's so great. It is the blackened drone metal album. But I'm happy to say we have a couple more for you. The first one being a band called Verwestung with Soft Hands, Pale Moon, which is a single song. It's an EP, but it's just one song, and it's about 20 minutes long, which is this dope sort of low-fidelity black gaze track with some absolutely howling vocals. It reminds me of like early Autumn for Crippled Children, or I believe Avelut from like a couple years ago. I kind of forget, but there was one black gaze project that actually caught my eye for the first time in years. But there are these very extended droney portions that sound exceptional. It's very simple, very warm, and very cozy, but it sounds strained. You know, this is one of the very few examples of black gaze that has sort of a melancholic, slightly happy feel to it that I actually enjoyed. Just because it experiments enough in directions that aren't stupid. I'm just glad I found this thing because it's way more emotional than most black gaze that I hear. I think this track is great. I just wish it existed somewhere off of YouTube. And then we have an album that I would disqualify, just from the section it's in. It's applicable elsewhere. It's just, I guess they wanted to make this thing more aesthetically pleasing to the eye. This is a band called Menace Ruin with an album called The Die Is Cast. Now, I think the first Menace Ruin full length would fit better here, as it's actually drone metal. It's just the noisiest black metal I've ever heard. Like, it makes Sortsend sound like appealing, but it's also like awesome in that way. It's like riffy, it's so dense, howling vocals over the top. You can't even tell it's a woman doing it. But here you have something that's like if Nico was on Quaaludes, which I believe she was at some point. But the guitar is even more dissonant and almost as loud as that first Menace Ruin album. You get a very thick neoclassical darkwave approach to this whole thing, even a bit of a Marshall industrial feel as the whole thing plods along with some bizarre sense of pride. It is simple yet vast. It is one of the noisiest records, pound for pound, in general on this whole chart, or that I'll just ever listen to, aside from like actual harsh noise. And even then, it's like, it beats a lot of harsh noise. The last track, called The Bison of the Earth, is 16 minutes long and just swamped in feedback. It is a crazy closer. I will definitely need further listens to understand this album more, but it is just the coolest. Conceptually, it is so amazing. It's like staring through a portal to the past in like the noisiest way possible. It's a super cool concept of an album. And it's a band I actually need to check out more of their stuff. You know, they have later material that is just really cool folky stuff, and I need to get into them. This album is great. I thought it was exceptional, and I'm glad that's all I have to cover for today. You know, I've been recording a while. It's late at night. Time to go to bed. But other than that, please, hope you enjoyed. Please check out Jen's Instagram down below, and check out mine as well as my ex. But other than that, even more importantly, I'd appreciate my like, subscribe, comments, questions, or concerns down below. If that could focus a little bit, would be fantastic. My camera's giving me all sorts of problems today. But also my Discord is in the description as well if you guys would like to check that out. I'm having a lot of fun. Love being there. But yeah, that is about it. Hope you guys have a good day. Bye.